I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're highlighting the debate over the authorization of new charter schools in New York, a controversial issue given the political influence of New York's teachers' unions, which are generally at odds with anything that isn't a traditional public school. For more on this issue, we're joined by Bob Lowry, Deputy Director for Advocacy, Research, and Communications for the New York State Council of School Superintendents, which is throwing its support behind a legal challenge from the state's teachers' union, challenging the authorization by SUNY of a handful of charter schools on Long Island. Thanks for making the time, Bob.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, for starters, I'm interested in your, I'll say, worldview on charter schools, because we spoke with the head of the Northeast Charter Schools Network earlier this year, and they framed charters as basically a positive force and really integral to the overall effort to educate kids in the Empire State, saying they, fit in with public education. Do you think ultimately they're a net positive or net negative force for New York's education system?
We've heard increasing concern about the growth of charter schools among superintendents really over the last year. That's been striking how that has amped up. Part of how we think about it, though, is I think it's initially conceived back in the late 1990s was that charter schools would be sort of laboratories of innovation and experimentation. And instead, in some cases, we have essentially two school systems operating within one community, Hempstead, Albany, for example. And that does create a drain on the ability of district schools to be able to serve their students. And so in some communities, I would say that charter schools can be a net negative because the district schools are less able to accommodate their growth. Place like New York City, 930,000 students total, district schools, charter schools, they're better able to absorb the introduction of new schools, charter schools.
Well, I think people might not necessarily realize that while charter schools are privately managed, as you point out, they are publicly funded alternative schools that typically might have, say, a longer school day and in some cases will outperform, say, neighboring public or district schools on different standardized exams. So is the issue that they exist, or is it that they exist with public dollars?
Maybe neither,
Okay.
in that, certainly to the extent that the introduction of charter schools, expansion of charter schools adversely affects the ability of district schools to serve their students, that's a concern. But I think, as I said, there are concerns about partly what students are attending the charter schools. Again, the ability of districts to maintain services and to compete. I think we do have to work on making sure that district schools are schools of choice. And in some cases, it's harder for us to offer things that charter schools have, like a longer school day. We have union contracts, and so forth. But I think we as school district leaders do have to, in some cases, contemplate trying to market ourselves better and be sure that we're responding to the needs and desires of families in the community. But there's also the issue of the students that charter schools are attracting and the students who are left in the district schools. Families may be more engaged in the charter schools, having made that choice. Also, in some of the charter schools, we see much lower percentages of students with disabilities, students for whom English is not their first language, students who are economically disadvantaged. Not in all cases, but in some cases. And that means that the district schools are left to educate those needier students with diminished resources.
Well, in order for a charter school to operate in New York, there are two different pathways for them to go down to get authorization. And one, which is the subject of a lawsuit that I mentioned at the top, is going through the State University of New York Charter School Institute to get approved. And as I mentioned, your organization has joined a lawsuit or issued a statement of support for a lawsuit that challenges the authorization of three schools on Long Island. What prompted you guys to back this challenge that initiated from the state's teachers union?
Two things. One is, as I said, just finding widening concern among our members, superintendents across the state, about the impact of charter schools. The other is how the state university exercises its responsibilities in approving charter schools. We agreed with the petitioners in the lawsuit, not just NYSUT, but parents of children in the two communities, Brentwood and Central Islip, about how SUNY exercised its responsibilities. And I think there are a few things. One is not responding to the volume of opposition that was expressed in the two communities, particularly in Brentwood, over about 3,800 petition signatures, letters, emails, statements from community leaders in opposition to that. SUNY, in their review, kind of dismissed those comments, saying the Institute carefully reviews and considers all district and public comments received prior to finalizing its recommendation. To me, that's dismissive, cursory, choose your adjective. Also felt that they did at least an incomplete review of the financial impact of the charter schools, potential financial impact of the charter schools on the district schools. And also that other issue that I mentioned about the proportion of students expected to attend a charter school who are economically disadvantaged, English language learners, students with disabilities. The law requires the charter authorizers, the state university, the Board of Regents to kind of rigorously review the enrollment targets and assure that they are comparable to what district schools have. And the academy charter schools have a questionable record in other schools that they operate on serving comparable shares of students with those characteristics. So those are three things that we felt that SUNY was not doing an adequate job of reviewing. And again, particularly the issue of the public opposition. It just felt very cursory, dismissive of how they reviewed that, not really taking that responsibility seriously.
Well, you're framing this as an issue with the process, and that's what the State Teachers Union flagged as well. But to my cynical ears, at least from the perspective of the State Teachers Union, it seems like their concern is more with the outcome than the process. And I wonder whether there is anything that SUNY could have done in the review process that would have satisfied them and resulted in no legal action that might have had a different outcome than what the teachers union would have wanted. I mean, is there a process that could have satisfied you, for example, that still resulted in the authorization of these charter schools?
What I would say is that, again, we're frustrated by the process, concerned about the approval of the schools, but it's not just us who raised questions. The state education, the Board of Regents said they felt SUNY did not do an adequate job of reviewing the proposals and in particular responding to the criticisms. So I think there could be changes in the process, and we would hope that the university would exercise more rigor in carrying out its responsibilities. Now, we would still have the concern among our members about the growth of charter schools, but a starting point is for SUNY to exercise greater care in reviewing and approving charter schools, as the regions and the state education department essentially recommended in refusing to grant initial approval to those proposals.
Yeah, the State Board of Regents has its own process for authorizing charter schools, and I'm curious if you think the inverse complaint could be made about their review process and this idea that maybe people are avoiding them because it's sort of assumed that they won't grant approval for charter schools, or that their expectations will be unreasonable or hard to match. What do you think of the state education department's process?
I'd say they're the agency charged in the state constitution to oversee education in New York State. And so ideally, we would say that they should have the final word. They did approve some charter schools this past week for either establishment or renewal. So it's not like they're just saying a blanket no to everyone. I really can't comment on, in detail about how their process compares to the state universities.
In terms of reviewing the approval process moving forward, does it seem like there's any appetite amongst the legislature to take this on, either to change what SUNY is authorized to do, to look at the state education departments? What sort of chatter, if any, is there?
There are a few bills that have been introduced. One direction would be to simply remove eliminate SUNY's authority to approve charter schools. Another would be to require outside New York City voter approval of the establishment or renewal of a charter school. Superintendents, some of our members in the lower Hudson Valley, they've suggested some process changes, requiring SUNY to make a more deliberate effort to seek public comment and comment from affected school districts, and to seriously respond to the comments that they do receive. Those are ideas that are being tossed around. I'm not sure what sort of traction they will get. Senator Shelley Mayer, chair of the Senate Education Committee, is the sponsor of one of those bills to require voter approval. One would think, as chair of the relevant committee, that she would have some sway, but everything right now is on hold with the state budget. Not sure how much time will be available in the post-budget season to address other issues, but I think this will be an issue that we and other public school groups will be advocating on. We're not expecting anything to be done on the issue as part of the budget.
Right. Well, earlier you mentioned how charter schools have flexibility that traditional public schools do not, in part because of the contracts that are negotiated with the local teachers unions. Is that something that should be examined, this idea of let's statutorily try to give school districts a little more flexibility, and maybe so they can be responsive to the local demands or local interests that might prompt some in the community to push for charter schools?
That's something that we have talked about. In fact, one of my prior jobs, I worked for Governor Mario Cuomo, and we proposed a bill to create what were called 21st century schools, which was intended to give district schools greater operating flexibility, similar to what charter schools enjoy. It was passed, but on Governor Pataki, it wasn't implemented. So that's an idea that we have discussed in the past. It's not something that we have advocated in recent years, but I think that is something that we have to wrestle with. Again, how do we make sure that district schools are schools of choice, and greater flexibility could be part of what they need to be able to do that.
Well, we've been speaking with Bob Lowry. He's the Deputy Director for Advocacy, Research, and Communications at the New York State Council of School Superintendents. Bob, as always, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you.
Fraud and lawsuit abuse raise car insurance costs for New Yorkers. Reforms are being proposed to mitigate their impact, but some Albany leaders want to keep the status quo. Information on these reforms is available at keepnewyorkaffordable.org.